Hello, everyone. My name is Karin Sumis, and I'm the Senior Curator at the Gardiner Museum. Welcome to our annual Gardiner Lecture Series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is located on the treaty lands and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and learn on this land. So you will notice that your mics and videos are muted and that the chat option has been disabled. There will be a Q&A following today's lecture, and so we invite you to send in your questions at any point during the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Also, please note that the closed captioning that is provided is automated and that any information that appears is not reviewed for accuracy. So we're pleased today to be presenting the Robert and Marian Cumming Lecture. This is an annual lecture which supports the interpretation of the Cumming collection of mint and ceramics at the Gardiner Museum. This collection was assembled by Robert Cumming and donated to the Gardiner Museum from 1991 to 2009. This is a collection of over 400 objects, of which you see a few examples here, and the objects span the late 18th century to the early 20th century. I would like to thank Marian Cumming for her continued support of the Gardiner Museum and for making this today's presentation possible. Today, we're excited to welcome our guest lecturer, Miranda Goodby, who is the Senior Curator of Ceramics at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery at Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire in the United Kingdom. Miranda studied history of design and the visual arts at Staffordshire University before doing her postgraduate qualification in art gallery and museum studies at Manchester University. She's worked as a curator at a variety of English museums, from small independent museums to the British Museum. Since 1995, she's been in charge of the ceramics collection at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery located in Stoke-on-Trent. There, she curates the largest collection of Staffordshire pottery in the world, as well as European, East Asian, and Middle Eastern ceramics. Miranda Goodby has taught ceramic history at undergraduate and graduate levels, and has also published numerous articles in British and American ceramic journals, as well as in exhibition catalogs. She is particularly interested in 18th century and 19th century Staffordshire earthenwares and stonewares, the development of the Staffordshire pottery industry from the 1750s onwards, as well as in the lives of pottery workers. And today, her talk is related to this topic. So Miranda Goodby will be presenting the paper entitled "I Conceived That It Shortens Their Lives, Working Conditions in the 19th Century Staffordshire Potteries." Please welcome Miranda, and I will now turn off my video and mic and hand it over to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kareem, for that introduction. And thank you also very much for your kind introduction and invitation to deliver the Robert and Marian Cumming Lecture this year. I'm very honoured to be part of the lecture series. Slide, please. There we go. I must start off by saying that there'll actually be very few images of complete pottery in this talk. It's mostly going to be about the pottery workers. And that's because when we look at the pottery and the porcelain in our own or in museum collections, it's very easy to be fascinated by their beauty and their age. They are the fragile survivors of a vanished world, when afternoon tea was a ritual, when the dining table would be reset with a highly decorated dessert service, and when the great international exhibitions were the showcases for the potter's art. We study the history of the factories, the artistic and design influences of the decoration on the wares. We may even know the names of some of the designers and the artists whose work decorates these pieces. But all too often, the ordinary men, women, and children who worked in the factories to make these wares are largely anonymous. And in the mid-19th century, there were around 47,000 people working in the North Staffordshire Potteries, where the British pottery industry was and is based. And so in this talk, I would like to look at the lives and experiences of some of the ordinary pottery workers. So there are Comparatively few examples of pottery in this talk, but there are numerous images of the workers from the early 19th century to early 20th century photographs. Slide, please. I conceive that it shortens their lives, the title of my talk today. It was a comment made by Ralph Bowyer, a 38-year-old pottery worker who was employed at the large firm of William Ridgway in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent, in the 1840s. Ralph was what is called an earthenware dipper. That is, he took the once fired or biscuit wares and dipped them into a liquid glaze prior to them being fired for a second time. The fired glaze formed a thin glassy surface which sealed in and protected any decoration under the glaze and made the wares impervious to liquid. He was an earthenware dipper, but the process was the same for china dipping. And here in the image you can see the glaze dipper, his assistant who's seated scraping off the excess ware, and in the background another assistant who is mixing the glaze so that it stays liquid and the solid particles don't sink to the bottom. As you can see, Ralph Bowyer's job involved immersing his hands and arms into this glaze many hundreds of times in a day. And he was assisted by two young boys, Samuel Cooper and Joseph Hill, and they were aged 16 and 11 years old respectively. Samuel, the 16-year-old, had been at work for 4 years, since he was 12, and the younger boy, Joseph, had only been at work for 5 weeks. Ralph himself had much more experience of dipping ware, having started aged 8 years of age. And could I have the next click, please? As he said, I have been a potter for 31 years. I have always worked in the dipping department or in departments connected with it. His work was skilled and well paid. His was an important job as every piece in the factory had to go through his hands and those of his assistants. And he received 5 shillings per day. That is 30 shillings a week for a 6-day week, or £1.50 in modern UK currency. It was a very good salary in 1840, but his rate of pay was not simply recognition of his skills, but of the risks that he ran every day in carrying out his job. You see, the active ingredient in the glaze he was working with was powdered lead oxide, and lead is a highly dangerous material, being poisonous. And as used in the potteries, it could be absorbed through the skin or breathed in as dust. Nonetheless, it had been the basis of standard glazes used in Staffordshire since the medieval period, and it was ideally suited for this. The finely ground lead oxide was mixed with water and powdered clay to form a thin liquid, and then the fired biscuit pottery dipped into it before a second firing, which fused it to the ware. Lead could be used in the glaze in its raw state or fitted. It tolerated a wide range of firing temperatures, and it gave a wonderful glassy, smooth surface. An additional attraction in using it as a glaze was its relatively low price. It was found in abundance in England with extensive lead mines within a few miles of Staffordshire, and its preparation for use by the industry was straightforward. Each factory had its own closely guarded glaze recipes, but the one constant was lead. Ordinary earthenware bodies used between 14 and 33% lead in the glaze mixture, as did bone china, depending on the quality of the ware, with the cheaper wares having a higher concentration of lead. It was well established, reliable, and affordable glaze material. It was just unfortunate that it exposed the pottery workers to lead poisoning. And Ralph's job exposed him particularly. In the liquid form, as part of the glaze material, it was absorbed through the skin, as he testified. Slide, please. In holding the rough biscuit ware between my fingers, it denudes them of the skin and makes them delicate and even raw at times when they bleed. I should think that the lead by this means is more rapidly absorbed. He was quite right. What perhaps he didn't realise was that as the liquid glaze dried on his arms and clothing, he was also breathing in lead dust, as well as swallowing minute particles carried in the air. And when he went home in his working clothes, he also carried powdered lead back to his family, with the risk of poisoning them too. Lead is a heavy metal, and once absorbed into the body is not expelled, but accumulates, so that exposure over a lengthy period leads to chronic lead poisoning, or what's known as plumbism. It attacks the central nervous and digestive systems, And the symptoms include colic, convulsions, paralysis of limbs, blindness, and a general emaciation, according to contemporary writers. And it can lead to death or permanent incapacity. And although there can be a wide variation in the susceptibility of individuals to lead exposure, it is particularly dangerous to children who absorb it at a higher rate than adults and whose nervous system is still developing, and to women, as it greatly increases the risk of miscarriage or stillbirth. Ralph Bowyer himself suffered from lead poisoning in what he considered to be a relatively mild form when he gave his evidence. Next slide, please. I have never been much affected myself, except now and then from a state of constipated bowel and pain, numbness, and stiffness in my wrists. I have not the proper use of them. A potential problem for someone whose work depended on the dexterity of his hands to do his job. Being aware of the dangers of lead poisoning, sensible working potters took what steps they could to mitigate its effects, not just for themselves, but for their young assistants. The drinking of milk before starting work to, as they said, line their stomachs. The taking of laxatives, or what were called opening medicines, to try to expel the lead from the digestive systems, and washing their hands before eating and drinking were about the most that they could do. Slide, please. In Ralph's testimony, he goes on to say, I have known boys suffer very much from this work. I knew 2 cases of fits and death to have resulted in boys working with me. I think children ought not to work here. The material is bad to work in. I look after the boys' washing because I know the consequences of neglect. I feel I should neglect my duty if I did not. And this photograph from the 60s, you can get a real sense of the youth of some of the child workers that were working alongside the adults. Slide, please. I have 3 children, he went on to say. 1 boy. I'd rather not place him in the same work with me. If I did, it would be because I could get nothing else for him to do, because I conceive that it shortens their lives. He was, of course, quite right. And here we have a group of dippers from the 1890s, and you can see that with perhaps 1, maybe 2 exceptions, they're all quite young, and the boy in the centre looks about 12, perhaps. Ralph himself died in 1850, aged only 47. Apart from the most basic documentary records required by the state, census returns, marriage and death record, he's left little documentary evidence of his life. And the only reason we know something about him and his work is that he was interviewed by Samuel Scriven, a British civil servant who, in 1840, was carrying out research into the employment of children in the pottery industry for a government report. Scriven visited over 170 factories in Stoke-on-Trent to see the working conditions for himself and interviewed a wide range of people: pottery factory owners, their managers, their workers, both adult and children, school teachers, church ministers, doctors, and police officers. And what makes his published report fascinating reading is that he took down the actual words of the people that he interviewed. And so their voices speak directly to us over a distance of more than 180 years. Ralph Bowyer was not the only glazed dipper that Scriven interviewed. He also took down the testimony of John Talbot, aged 24, a dipper at Minton and Boyle's earthenware factory. Slide, please. John said, my business is to dip the ware as it comes from the printers and the biscuit warehouse. The process doesn't take a moment, but my hands and arms are always wet with a solution or mixture. I don't know what this mixture is composed of exactly. It's chiefly lead. They tell us there is no arsenic, but we have our own thoughts about that. It destroys our health. It affects women more than men. And you can see here in this illustration of around about 1840, exactly what his work involved. Next slide, please. Scriven also spoke to some of the women assistants who worked in the dipping house. Anne Baker, who worked at the Ridgeway factory where Bowyer had been working, told him, I have worked 3 years in these works, first in the biscuit warehouse, now in the dipping house. My duty is to scrape the uneven dipping off the ware when dry. The occupation is a very unhealthy one. I cannot eat my food as I used to do. It affects my chest very much, makes me cough. I have a tightness on my chest. Nonetheless, with no regulations to control the use of lead, Manufacturers had little or no incentive to look for an alternative to this cheap and useful glaze ingredient, and many were happy to blame the ill effects of working with the glaze on what one factory manager described as the careless, dirty, slovenly habits of the workmen. While the workers themselves were so used to the idea that a lead glaze was essential to pottery making that they normalised the risks and were more concerned about the possibility of the addition of arsenic to the glaze by some manufacturers. Next slide, please. A few manufacturers were sufficiently concerned to provide hand washing facilities for their workers. Most did not. Others either dispensed milk to their dippers, and this is a rather nice photograph from the early 1920s of the milk being distributed to the glaze dippers at the Minton factory. The milk came from the estate of the owner of the factory. The milk was distributed to line the stomachs of dippers and prevent the absorption of lead. Other manufacturers distributed what was known as an acidulated drink, which comprised dilute sulfuric acid mixed with water and sweetened. It was known as elixir of vitriol, and I don't think I would have liked to have tasted it. But these employers who did consider their workers' health were the exception. I should point out that the Ridgway factory, where Ralph Bowyer and Anne Baker worked, and the Minton and Boyle factory, where John Talbot worked, were well-run companies, and their owners were noted for the good care that they took of their workers. William Ridgway's employees had access to a health scheme which covered medical costs, and he built a chapel and housing for his workers. Herbert Minton built a church and housing for his workers and encouraged his painters and decorators of china and earthenware to attend classes at the local art school, which he heavily subsidised. And yet both were largely unconcerned about what we would today regard as basic health and safety issues on their factories. And this was typical of the period. For most of the 19th century, there was very little legislation to control what went on within the pottery factories. Indeed, it was not until the 1860s, long after Scriven's report was completed in 1841, that potteries were legally classified as factories. And as such, in the 1840s, they were exempt from any government legislation relating to working conditions, including hours of work and the age of employees. Slide, please. In part, this was because the potteries used very little machinery and almost no steam-driven machinery. Pottery firms operated more as a series of linked but separate skills-based workshops within one building, with the pots being passed from workshop to workshop as they went through making and the decorating processes. And there could be as many as 20 different processes. Each element, making, decorating and firing of the wares, was dealt with by a different team. And pottery workers were apprenticed to one element of pottery making, whether it was clay preparation, as we see here, throwing, pressing, printing, painting, and rarely moved out of their skill set. It was a very labour-intensive industry as a result of the lack of machinery. At the making end of the factory, most skilled potters were employed on a yearly contract, under which they received not a fixed weekly wage, but were paid an agreed price for each item that they made, what was known as piecework. Slide, please. But in order to produce enough pieces to make a living, the journeyman potter needed to employ a number of assistants to work alongside him. With no mechanisation, the thrower, for example, needed someone to turn his wheel, as we see here. He also needed someone to prepare his clay, and possibly a third assistant to carry away the thrown pots, so that he could concentrate on his job, which was to actually throw the wares. A presser of plates or bowls needed someone to turn his machine, someone to prepare his clay, and someone to run his moulded wares to the stove where the clay would dry before being released from the plaster mould. And the printer, as we see here, also needed 3 assistants, someone to cut out the printed pattern as it came from his press, someone to apply it to the surface of the pot, and a third person to wash off the paper, leaving the transferred design, and so on and so forth through so many of the different processes in the factory. To make a decent living, therefore, the potter needed to employ his assistants at the lowest possible wages. He was subcontracting his workers. And the cheapest workers were usually children, that is, classified as under 14 years of age. These child assistants, and you can see here in this image that the little girl cutting out the paper and the 2 people assisting the thrower, they're not badly drawn adults, they are young workers. The child assistants were directly employed by the journeyman potter, not by the factory owner. Their hours of work, conditions of employment, and rates of pay were set by their master, who paid them their wages out of his earnings, and through their labour was enabled to earn more and therefore to pay them. The hardest work for these young assistants was that of the jigger turner, whose job was to rotate the wheel for the presser, the person who made plates and dishes, bowls and saucers, and the presser's mould runner, whose job required him or her to carry the heavy plaster moulds filled with clay to a drying stone and return with the empty moulds so that the presser who employed them could reuse them. Samuel Scriven interviewed scores of children from dozens of factories, noting how many were employed at each factory and dividing them into those under the age of 14 and those between 14 and 21. The difference was he considered only those under 14 to be children. From 14 upwards, he regarded them as young persons, largely because by that age they were usually formally bound as apprentices to the factory owner and employed directly by the factory owner. He also asked the factory owners themselves how many children of 13 and under were employed in and about their works, and it's quite clear that the place were full of young children. Children for whom the factory management had no responsibility as they were not their employees. Scriven also asked the children he interviewed a series of questions: how old they were, how long they had been at work, what their job involved, what hours they did, and what pay they received, how many people were in their family, whether they could read or write, did they go to church or chapel, what did they have to eat, what clothes they had, how they were treated at work, and so forth. The results make shocking reading to modern eyes, but describe what were clearly regarded as perfectly normal conditions at the time. Slide, please. And I think what's so particularly interesting is this survivor of a series of stereoscopic slides from the 1860s that had taken at an unknown factory. Nobody's sure where it was taken, but it was showing day-to-day scenes on the factories. And you only have to look at the size of the children as they stand next to the workbenches to start to work out how old they probably are. Evidence from William Mason, aged 12, who was a jigger turner working for Adams and Sons, a firm that exported a huge amount of wares all around the world. The jigger is the machine that the presser uses to form his wares, and the jigger turner is what this little boy in the foreground is doing, turning a handle around and around and around to power the wheel that the presser is using. I get 2 shillings a week. That's 10 pence in modern money. I never works overtime. We come at 6 in the morning and leave at 6 at night. John Jolliffe is very good to me. He licks me sometimes. He hits me. Never but twice in his life. 'Twas with a strap for spinning the bats off. That is, turning the jigger too quick for fun and throwing the clay off the wheel. I think I deserve to catch it. I'm allowed half an hour for breakfast, 1 hour for dinner. I'd rather be a jigger than a tailor, and I'd sooner be at work than at home. So John Jolliffe was clearly quite a reasonable master to little William, who perhaps wasn't the best behaved child of all. Slide, please. Here is Charles Perry, a year older, working at Mr. Joseph Clemenson's factory. And in this image, you can see the little jigger turner in the foreground and the 2 mould runners. The moulds would be used by the presser. He would press his wares over them, and then the wares would be taken away. So you're carrying heavy plaster of Paris moulds. I run moulds for William Troughton. Sometimes I wedge clay, that's preparing the clay for him. I've worked for 2 years, can't read or write. I come about 5:30 and begin to light the fire. I leave at 6. He means 6 p.m, of course. William Troughton gives me now and then 3 pence more than my wages if I'm a good boy. He sometimes scolds if I'm a bad boy. He never yet flogged me. I go home to dinner and get sometimes bacon and potatoes. I have very good health and like my trade. Sometimes it is too heavy. So these are 12 and 13-year-old children doing a 12 or 12 and a half hour day at the factory. And don't forget, they've got to walk there and walk home as well. Perhaps not going so very far if young Charles can get home for his midday meal, but nonetheless, long days for growing children. Could I have the next slide, please? In the mid-19th century, children started work at the potteries at the age of 8 or 9. Only in cases of extreme poverty were they sent to work before that age. In part, this was due to the hours of work, usually 12 hours a day, often 6 days a week. You see, it's almost impossible for a 7-year-old child to work efficiently for 72 hours per week, so it simply wasn't worthwhile employing them for most jobs. But these child workers of 8 or 9 did some of the heaviest and least skilled jobs in the factory. They would arrive before their master to sweep out the place of work, light the fires and fetch water before the older workers arrived. And then they would work under the direction of their master, turning the wheel, fetching and carrying loads of clay, preparing the clay, as you see it here, taking up great weights of clay, slapping them down one onto another to drive out the air bubbles that would otherwise ruin the finished work. Next slide, please. They were also used for general duties around the factory, fetching clay, as you see here on the right, taking away waste clay or broken pots to be disposed of, as well as running errands and messages for the older workers. If the children were lucky, their master might reward them with a penny or two extra, as we've seen. If they were unlucky, and there was an order that needed filling at short notice, they might have to work over hours until 9 p.m. for no extra money, for without their labour, the journeyman potter could not work. It's remarkable how many of the children thought it worthwhile to mention that they were never beaten or strapped by their master, or at least only when they deserved it. The fact that they mention how rarely it happened shows how commonplace it must have been otherwise. The children themselves were largely illiterate. Starting work at 8 or 9 doesn't give you a very long period for learning to read and write, besides which it was not compulsory and you had to pay for the privilege. And for most of them, they'd usually been minding younger children at home before they went out to work. Where they could, most of them attended Sunday school on their day off, where they would be taught to read and possibly to write. Others did not go either to Sunday school or to church, as they had no decent clothes to go in. Their diet was largely bread, potatoes, bacon and milk, and occasionally a bit of beef. It wasn't, of course, just boys that were employed in the factories. You can see here there were girls, and mostly the girls were not employed with the presses, although there were occasions of that. They were more often employed as child painters or in the printing workshops. Next slide, please. Here we have evidence of Sarah Bowers, again working at William Ridgway's factory. She was aged 13. I'm a paper cutter in the printing room. I've been employed 4 years. There are 5 of us in the same room. She means 5 girls, not 5 people in total. We'll be working with 6 women and 3 men. The oldest cutters come at 6. I come at 7 and go home at 8 o'clock at night, sometimes at 9. That's about 3 times a week. On other days, I go at 6. Next slide, please. The printers pay the transferers and they pay me. I get 1 shilling and 6pence a week. I expect my wage will be increased 6pence this week or next. I can read and write a little. I have a father, a blacksmith. He's been out of work now 11 weeks. Mother does nothing but look after the rest of the family. One sister is a potter and gets 9 shillings a week as a transferer, and that's the job that you can see here depicted in this engraving from the 1840s. This, with my 1 shilling and 6pence, is all that father has to support 8 of us. That's why children were being sent out to work at these tender ages. For in many cases, it was the children's wages and that of their siblings that supported the family. Father was dead, or out of work, or too ill to work, and mother was at home looking after the children too young to work. And there may be 5, 6, 7, or more people dependent on the wages of 2 or 3 children. They were largely uncomplaining about their lot, unless their dinner hour, their playtime, was cut short, or they had to work over hours without any extra pay. At the age of 14, most of these children would have been bound as apprentices. Little Eliza would expect to become a transferer like her sister. And they would then have been formally employed and paid by the pottery firm. Their working conditions improved. And as apprentices, particularly the boys, they would sometimes find themselves employing younger children as assistants, and under the same conditions that they themselves had been employed under only a few years earlier. Next slide, please. This image of a dish presser and his child assistant, again from the 1860s, shows not only the age of the little mould runner who's working with him, but how young the actual presser himself appears to be. I couldn't find an image of a girl as a mould runner, but they did exist. In 1840, Eliza Oakes, aged 10, was working as an assistant to Isaac Mellor, an apprentice muffin maker. As a muffin maker, he made small plates. Isaac himself was only 14, and it was obviously a difficult working relationship between the two children. For according to Eliza, when he hits me, I hit him again, but I come off worst. There were children employing children in the factories. Indeed, most of the people employed in the pottery industry at this period were comparatively young, with the majority of the adults being under 45. Poor pay, long hours, and the risk of casual violence were only some of the hazards of starting work as a child in the pottery industry at this period. For although all the workers were aware of the risks of early death that the glaze dippers ran in working with lead, few were aware of the risks that they all ran on a daily basis. Next slide. Mid-19th century pottery factories, unlike contemporary textile works, were rarely purpose-built and were often adapted from another industrial or domestic building with additional structures added as necessary. The buildings were usually arranged around one or more courtyards with ovens in the middle. Coal for firing would be stored in the yards alongside wasters or defective wares for disposal, and crates of finished goods for dispatch. In many factories, there was no water laid on, so it had to be fetched from outside the works, and sanitary facilities were rarely provided for the workers. The result was that the pottery works were usually inefficiently laid out, cramped, hot, airless, and dirty. The image on the left gives probably a reasonably accurate depiction and is said to show the Spode works in Stoke in the 1840s. The one on the right is rather more idealised, and it's quite clear that even then people were doing factory tours, as you can see by the well-dressed group of people in the foreground who appear to have brought their dog to the factory. Next slide, please. This is just to give you a sense of how integrated the factories were with the general life of the town. This is an image of Burslem in Stoke-on-Trent in 1898. And if you can see all those little circles that occur in every street and every back street, those are the ovens in which the wares were fired. And as you can see, there was no zoning or distinguishing of the commercial, residential and industrial parts of the town. So even where it doesn't say earthenware manufacturer, each of those circles is a pottery oven which would have been belching out smoke. Next slide, please. Pottery in this period was fired with coal. And with almost 1,000 pottery ovens across the city firing on a weekly basis, Stoke-on-Trent, like most industrial centres of the period, was permanently wreathed in smoke, and its buildings blackened with it. Smoke filled the air and the lungs of all the residents of the 6 towns of the potteries. But the pottery workers were exposed to further hazards in addition. As I've said, pottery making is a very dusty process. As the unfired clay dries, it becomes dusty. It's usually mixed with other raw materials which have themselves been ground to a powder before use. And the process of pottery making produced additional dust, which was breathed in by the potters in their workshops. The problem with clay dust is it is extremely fine. Although much of it settles on the floors, walls, and equipment, the clothing and the bodies, a significant amount of it remained airborne, almost invisible in tiny particles, and consequently is breathed deep into the lungs. Next slide, please. In addition, chinaware was bedded, that is, set into ground flint silica, before being put into the saggers, which you can see here on the left, and then fired in the ovens. And the ovens themselves were fueled with dusty coal. And one of the most dangerous jobs in the pottery industry was that of the men that you can see here, who were the placers, taking the saggers, the clay boxes filled with pottery, stacking them up inside the kiln. The kiln would then be fired, and when firing had finished, they would be responsible for bringing the wares out. and they were often working in very hot conditions because the profit often depended on how quickly these wares could be brought out of the hot ovens and passed on to the next stage of the process. So, as well as carrying very heavy weights, they were often working in extremely hot conditions as well, which is very bad for their heart. Having come out of the biscuit oven, any flaws in the fired wares were ground off or scoured off, which created still more dust. Next slide, please. Annie Williams worked as a scourer at the Minton and Boyle China factory in Stoke-on-Trent, and she explained the health risks of her job to Inspector Samuel Scriven. We receive our ware from the biscuit oven in the dusty and rough state. Our business is to scour it with sandpaper and stone. This occupation is very unhealthy. Not many scourers live long. It takes some off sooner than others. None of us are ill now, except we all feel overloaded upon the chest. Sometimes we cough very much, especially in the morning when we first begin. Scriven himself commented that there were particles of dust flying in all directions. The air is loaded with it. Essentially, they were breathing in silica dust. Today, factories are only too aware of the problem. Dust and cleanliness is paramount, with overalls, washing facilities and dust extractors as standard. But in the 19th century, none of these existed. And as a consequence, lung disease was endemic within the industry. Doctors coming to work in the area in the mid-19th century were shocked by the level of lung disease and its acceptance by the population as a normal state of affairs. The conditions in underventilated and often overheated workshops were recognised as the cause of bronchitis, emphysema, silicosis, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, known collectively in the potteries at the time as potter's asthma or potter's consumption. And combined with the ever-present threat of tuberculosis, the result was that working potters' lives were not only shortened, but as one writer described it, became a lingering death for a period of up to 20 years. 2 years after Scriven's report into working conditions was published, the trade unionist William Evans wrote The Life and Death of a Working Potter, published in 1865. It described the effect of lifelong exposure to dust on workers' health by using, as his example, the earthenware dish presser Enoch Stevenson. The first thing in the morning and the last thing at night was to cough, 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 and still to work, work, work. The lozenge was constantly in the mouth, and other sources of relief resorted to, but the good man's lungs were weekly, daily, hourly wasting away, and death was only a question of time. Now a walk uphill became a pain, and the panting sufferer had to rest by the way. Still, for all working purposes, the man was as good as ever. Enoch Stevenson died aged 51 on his way to work, having been in chronic ill health for more than a decade, slowly choked to death by the dust that he'd worked in since he was 8 years old. The dangers weren't over, however, once the wares had been fired. They could still be dangerous, especially if they were to be richly decorated with a coloured ground under the glaze. Next slide, please. Henry Hume, a ground layer at the Daniel factory, where this plate was decorated, reported, "The nature of our work is very pernicious. The mixing of the colours and laying them onto the biscuit ware in their finely powdered state. They are all minimal. They affect our lungs, and a vast many complain of it." However, the majority of employers simply did not see this as their concern. As Jessie Lingate, one of the managers at the same Daniel factory in Stoke-on-Trent, reported, next slide please, "There is a dust arising from the ware in fettling it, that is, removing flaws before firing, which is pernicious to health. Scouring and ground laying is also bad, but it is the fault of the workmen if they do not clean themselves." Once the wares had then been dipped and fired, the lead in the glaze covering them was no longer a hazard to the workers, and the painters who decorated the glazed wares were at much less risk in their profession. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, the bright enamel colours that they used involved the use of finely ground, dangerous minerals, including cobalt, manganese, copper, arsenic, antimony, nickel, and chrome, the raw materials of which were often ground and prepared by the painters themselves. And you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, the girls grinding the wares with on the desks, and they would have been using oil to carry it. Susanna Lees, a who ground the colours, reported, "The colours we use are mixed with spirits of tar, turpentine and oils. Persons of weak constitutions are not able to stand it. The spirits, which are very strong scent, are sometimes too strong for them." Next slide, please. Hannah Barker, age 40, superintendent of the girls' painting room at Messrs. Minton and Boyle's factory, said, "I have about 16 girls in this room. 9 of them are under 13. All of them are healthy now, but I have buried many out of this room. The smell of the turpentine and the paint and the closeness of the room often occasions illness." Nonetheless, enamel painting was considered one of the best and easiest jobs in the industry. The painters, male and female, but mostly female, sat to their work in light-filled workrooms that were kept warm and which were cleaner than many of the other departments. But they too worked long hours, at least 12 and often as many as 15 hours a day when there was a rush order to be filled. Difficult if you're under 13. For the enamel painters, it wasn't too bad, comparatively speaking. But the work of the Majolica paintresses a few years later was much more hazardous. Next slide, please. Majolica pottery was introduced in the 1850s at the Minton factory. It was a sturdy earthenware, usually moulded into elaborate shapes, and with the surface decorated with coloured glazes painted on to pick out the moulded details. It was novel, brightly coloured, and comparatively cheap to produce, since all the coloured glazes could be applied at the same time, unlike the enamel painted wares, which usually needed numerous expensive firings to fix the different colours. Majolica was extremely successful commercially, and in the second half of the 19th century, it was made at numerous factories in Stoke-on-Trent. But while popular with manufacturers and customers alike as an inexpensive ware both to make and to purchase, it came as a cost to the health of the young girls and the women who were employed to paint the wares with the coloured lead glazes. But the success of Majolica was partly due to the rich lead content of the glazes, not 14 to 32% as in the rest of the industry, but instead between 40 and 60%. As Majolica increased in popularity through the 1870s and 80s, made by more and more factories, the number of paintresses working with it increased. And many of the factories making this type of ware in the late 19th century were smaller firms with small profit margins in which working conditions were particularly poor. Numerous young women were affected, becoming paralysed, subject to fits, losing their sight, or even dying from the effects of working with lead. These cases were being reported in the papers by the 1880s and 1890s as they increased. At the same time, the British establishment was finally becoming interested in working conditions and industrial disease. Scriven's report into child employment in 1840 was one of the first of a number of government-sponsored studies carried out in the mid-19th century, which led in 1862 to potteries for the first time being classified as factories and therefore coming under national factory legislation and regulations. And this coincided with the publication in Britain of occupational mortality rates and a consequent interest in the study of occupational medicine. So that by the 1880s, a number of influential papers were highlighting the connections between employment in the pottery industry and ill health, singling out those particularly exposed to the serious evils of lead. Next slide, please. Not just the dippers and the gloss placers, as we see here, but also the ground layers, the colour mixers, and the Majolica paintresses. A few years later, faced with this information, the British government classified the manufacture of earthenware as a dangerous trade. It was recommended, but not enforced, that no one under the age of 16 should be employed in dipping houses, and that washable protective clothing should be provided, kept at the place of work, and washed on the premises. And that's how you can date these photographs from Cup and Saucer Land to the 1890s. The workers are all provided with white overalls and additional aprons to wear over them. But I would say that looking at the young boys reclining on the ground at the foreground of this picture, and the little lad in the doorway at the back, they all appear to be under 16 to my eyes. In 1896, it became compulsory for manufacturers and doctors to notify all cases of lead poisoning contracted in a factory or workshop. And in that year, 1,030 cases of lead poisoning were reported, of whom 382 were Staffordshire potters. Of the number, out of 1,000, not so great, but it was 50% more than in any other single trade. Being a potter poisoned you. Of the 382 cases of lead poisoning, 148 were dippers or glossed placers, as we see here, men, and 178 were the people who cleaned the ware after the dippers' assistants, the Majolica paintresses, the printers' transferers, and ground layers, all of whom were predominantly women. It was clear that the women workers, and the young women workers in particular, were suffering disproportionately from lead poisoning. Next slide, please. As they were largely employed in those processes which involved the use of lead. And here again, 1890s, we see the dipper with a young boy assistant and a young girl assistant, and two girls who clearly are working in the dipping department, just crossing the yard. A rather nice little photograph as they're posing for their photograph in the middle of the factory itself. And you can see the piles of coal at their feet. They have been provided with protective clothing, which is to be washed at the factory, but they're still there working in those lead processes. By 1898, there was a parliamentary inquiry into the shocking prevalence of lead poisoning amongst young women, with the result that a couple of years later, manufacturers had to stop using raw lead in their glazes, though they could still use the rather safer fritted lead. And that continued until the 1940s. Women, children, and young persons continued to work with lead right up to World War I, when further restrictions were imposed. But by this time, however, there were far fewer young children working in the potteries. The classification of potteries as factories had at first restricted the ages at which children could be employed and the hours of work that they could do, and had also gradually brought to an end the direct employment of children by journeyman potters and the exploitation that accompanied it. But it was the introduction of compulsory free education in the 1880s that took the youngest children out of the potteries. By 1880, children had to attend school until the age of 10. By 1899, this had reached 12 years, and 14 years by 1918. Next slide, please. As the youngest and cheapest workers were withdrawn from the market, they were largely replaced by the next cheapest workers, boys and girls in their early teens, and young women, because of course women were always paid less than men. So this photograph, which is from around about 1910, 1915, as you can see, still shows a number of teenagers. But by now these children were being directly employed by the factory owners, with their hours of work and rates of pay regulated in the same way as the adult workers, and their conditions too had improved. But it was not until the end of World War I in 1918 that children under the age of 14 were finally removed from the pottery factories. Next slide, please. If you come to England, to Stoke-on-Trent, and you visit the Potteries Museum Art Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent, you cannot fail to notice the impressive brick mural that decorates the entrance. It depicts the main industries of Stoke-on-Trent: coal mining, metalworking, and of course pottery making. In the pottery making section, a child worker is shown, a little girl painting on pottery, dressed in early 19th century clothing. It's a charming image, but it's heavily romanticised and sanitised, and a million miles away from the day-to-day experiences of the little child workers of the Victorian potteries. And as you see, the thrower and the press are there beside her, and the kilnmen carrying the wares in and out of the kiln, ready to be sent off. It's a lovely mural, but it really tell you the conditions of the great majority of the pottery workers, what they actually went through. So when you're enjoying your pots in your own collection or in a museum collection, do enjoy them. They're beautiful things. They came out of a dirty, scruffy factory in a dirty, scruffy town. They were made by people whose working conditions were often poor, but who nonetheless took a great pride in what they did and in producing beautiful things, clay and coal. And remember the little boy who, despite his working conditions, saying how many hours he worked, still said, "I'd rather be a jigger than a tailor." He would rather have been a potter than anything else. If you want to get a truer idea of the conditions of the 19th century pottery industry for child workers and for adults, I would recommend that you seek out a copy of the Scriven Report into the Employment of Children and Young Persons, much of which can now be found online, as well as the autobiography of Charles Shaw, When I Was a Child, describing his experiences in the 1840s, or the novel Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett, which draws heavily on Shaw's autobiography. I'm going to have the last slide, please. And those are the two books that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miranda. This was really amazing. Thank you for shedding light on this very human aspect of ceramic history, one that is extremely important for us to think about and also to present in a museum context as well. And I was wondering if you can talk about some of the strategies that the potteries are, the potteries museums are employing to present that that part of the history of the products that were made there.
Well, I have to confess that the Potteries Museum itself is very much a museum of the object. It shows off the objects themselves, it arranges them by factory, by type, by decoration, and so on. But we are very fortunate in having another museum in the Stoke-on-Trent Museum Service, and that's the Gladstone Pottery Museum. And that is one of the very few surviving Victorian factories, and in effect the only one that has unchanged since it was built really in the 1860s. And it is, as you saw with the engraving, a conglomeration of buildings around a couple of yards with bottle ovens and the workshops arranged around it. And that is where we interpret not only how the pots were made, you go around the factory and you can go through the processes, but also the working conditions and the techniques and so forth of how people lived. And in one of the buildings associated with that, we have some rooms which are set up as a doctor's surgery, which again addresses health issues. And so we do have costumed interpreters and we have demonstrators. It's a difficult thing to get over because so many people in the pottery in Stoke-on-Trent have worked in the pottery industry, and those conditions from the 1840s are a long way now from people's recollections. If your parents or your grandparents worked in the pottery industry, their experiences are very, very different. And so we find that actually people's recollection of it all is rather more sort of romanticised. The bottle ovens have got almost a sort of a mythic quality in Stoke-on-Trent. They appear decorating all sorts of things, but actually they were dirty, filthy things. And so it's quite important to try to sort of keep that connection and not just to romanticise the past. But we use the Gladstone largely for that process.
That's great. I look forward to visiting one day. We still have time for more questions. So if anyone wants to write down some questions in the Q&A, you're welcome to do so. I do have many questions, so I'll follow up with one of my own. And I was wondering if you can tell us a bit how the practices in Staffordshire compare to other places in Europe, for instance, in other European manufactories, whether in the 18th or 19th century. Do we see as much this tendency to employ very young laborers and so on, or put to place them in the riskiest positions as well?
I think you do. I mean, it just seems to have been perfectly normalized that children were there to be treated as very small adults. And so certainly in the younger children could be put out to work and contribute to the family income, the better it was. And you do find that in, say, Bedfordshire in the south of England, children were going to learning to plait straw to make straw hats from the age of 4 or 5 as soon as they became dexterous enough with their fingers. So the potteries were actually regarded as being not as bad as some industries. On the continent, I think it was similar, but Stoke-on-Trent and England generally industrialised so early on. And the idea was that you could get employment quite easily as a child. I think on the continent, perhaps not so heavily industrialised so early, And so by the time you get into the second half of the 19th century, there's more restrictions and a care for those young workers.
Well, thank you very much. So we will conclude our lecture for today. Oh, a comment just came in, so I'll take the time to read it before we log off. So thank you so much, Miranda. This was extraordinary. I'm just wondering if you have future plans for this wonderful research, perhaps writing an essay or an exhibit. It reminds me of the Chipstone Foundation's exhibit, The Cost of Things, which tackled similar themes, but your deep knowledge of ceramic history and specifically senses of place adds so much. Speaking personally, I am an historian of disability and material culture and decorative art, so I'm fascinated by the way that these practices of making produced disability.
I did an article in the catalogue for Majolica Mania, the exhibition that's currently on in Baltimore, on sort of particularly lead poisoning, because the Majolica glazes were so particularly lethal, fatal in many cases. And it is a really interesting subject. There are so many elements that you can pick up on with the employment of potters and the working conditions, how they were paid, the fact that right into the middle of the 19th century, most of them were still on annual contracts and not free to leave to go to work at other places. And I think that's something to bear in mind when you're looking at these working conditions, when the dippers and so forth are talking about the conditions that they're working under. They were bound for a one-year contract. They couldn't leave to go to work elsewhere. They were stuck with the conditions that they were with. They could complain about it, but they couldn't hand in their notice and walk away very easily at all. Yes, I would say that the article that I did for Majolica Mania is, I think, still on the Bard Graduate Centre's website, so people might be interested in having a look at that.
Well, thank you so much. It was really a fantastic lecture, really eye-opening, and we thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So we'll be concluding our program. Thanks to everyone who attended. We're going to be hosting our next lecture on June 10th from 6 to 7 p.m. This one will be taking place at the Gardiner Museum. So you can visit our website for more information about how to register. And the talk will be delivered by Anya Montiel and is entitled Moving Beyond Boundaries, Indigenous Women and Clay. So for more information, you can follow the instruction in the chat box regarding registration. So thank you very much once more, Miranda, and thanks to all for joining us today. And I wish you all a fantastic day. Thank you.